welcome back to my channel. Bonsoir et bienvenue sur ma chaîne. My name is Muriel and this evening I will be doing a movie review for part 1 of Denis Villeneuve's adaptation of Dune. Indeed, I went to see this long-awaited movie yesterday at the cinema. I will already tell you that it was awesome. My reaction when I came out of the movie theatre was, wow. It was that kind of movie. It was wow. It was amazing. So if you already want to know whether you should take the time to go and see it, as a book fan, duh, obviously, like, yes, of course. As a science fiction fan, yes, most definitely, of course. And if you're just a fan of good, great cinema, of a great cinematic experience, I would also recommend you go and see it. Basically, I would only discourage people from seeing it if they hate Dune or hate science fiction in any kind of medium. I will keep this review fairly spoiler-free for most of it, insofar as I'm going to assume that if you're going to watch this review, you've probably already read the book, but you might still want to be surprised by what's in the movie from the book, how they adapted some passages, so most of this will be spoiler-free, but then at the end I will go into a more detailed, in-depth comparison between the movie and the source material, the elements from the book I found which I enjoyed, things that were just a little bit different. That will be at the very end, so if you really want to go into the movie blind, but still as a book fan, you can very easily. The only negative I want to introduce with regards to this review, it has nothing to do with the movie itself, but the movie-going experience was a bit tarnished by the fact I went to see it on Imax, but that is because I'm a very sensitive person. And honestly, I'd never seen a movie on Imax before, and it was just a bit overwhelming for me. The sound was insane. I thought my eardrums were gonna blow a few times, and like the sound vibrations, I could feel them in my chest cage, and even visually it was almost a bit taxing on my eyes, and I came out of the movie theatre absolutely exhausted, even felt a bit borderline ill. So keep that in mind if you are a very sensitive person like I am. IMAX might not be the best way to enjoy this movie, actually. If you're not easily affected by this, however, yeah, then definitely go see it on IMAX or just a huge screen. I just wanted to mention it because some of you might also be hypersensitive, and that might actually be detrimental to your enjoyment of the movie. So visually, this was a feast, an absolute rich, majestic feast for the eyes. I mean, it's one of those movies, it's just candy for the eyes. It's just magnificent, the cinematography, the amazing desert shots, the setting of Arrakeen and of Caladan, and the spaceships, and, well, I'll get to that in my spoiler-full section, just the way some of the technology was conceptualized. The design work was amazing. It was hallmark science fiction in a way, but very unique as well. I mean, it's Dune. It's nothing else you've seen before. It is Dune. I think Denis Villeneuve, and I'm sorry for the director of photography that I don't know his name, or whoever he or she was, the job they did was just amazing. The costume design was beautiful. Strange and yet not completely wacky weird. I mean, not too wacky weird. Like I said, the conceptual designs for tech, spacecraft, and things like that was just, again, unique, and at the same time you can recognize that this is a futuristic science fiction setting. There's something very brutal about the architecture of Arrakeen and a lot of the spacecraft, even the Atreides spacecraft. The setting of Caladan is very specific. The setting on Seleucia Secundus is very specific. The vibe and look of Guy de Prime is very specific and highly contrasted to that of Caladan or Arrakeen. And yeah, the costumes, I want to say anthropological design, I guess, because the Fremen, you know they're Fremen. And the Atreides, you know they're Atreides. And the Harkonnens, you know they're Harkonnens. And the Sardaukar also have a very specific look, and it all makes sense. It all fits within the picture I had of things within Dune, within the Duneverse. There's also just this beautiful attention to detail, like carvings on headboards, little like the hand signals, not really spoil it, little hand signals specific to House Atreides, how they communicate with one another in secret. And the makeup as well, there's specific types of makeup to distinguish between specific types of characters like Mentats or the Sook Doctor, Dr. Yue. The design of the Bene Gesserit as well was fairly sober, but very distinct and menacing. My mum, so I saw this movie with my parents. My mum is not a SFF fan at all, though she loved the Lord of the Rings movies, and she really loved the Dune movie, and she understood pretty much everything that was going on, and so she called the Bene Gesserit space nuns, which, fair enough, but that made me laugh. I mean, they're creepy space nuns, you know that there's an aura of power to them, even if you haven't read the source material, you can tell something is up with those Bene Gesserit. Coming back to the desert shots, though, like these wide swaths of sand dunes with some notes of orange to denote the presence of spice, and of course the movements of the sandworms within the sand was just beautiful. Now, personally, biome-wise, deserts aren't really my thing. I'm more of a forest person myself. But you know what I thought to myself when I saw these beautiful vistas? I was like, can someone please do this on that same level for the Left Hand of Darkness? Because that then would be with tundras and glaciers and vast expanses of snow. I feel like the person who was director of photography could do something amazing for the Left Hand of Darkness based on what I saw. And so now we're going to move on to a very important part of any movie to me, the OST. The OST was basically perfect. I never really doubted it, but Hans Zimmer delivered, and he delivered hard. Oh my god. The music was just, again, epic, majestic, perfectly suited to the story and the universe of Dune. I find it really neat that apparently Hans Zimmer, I learned this very recently, is himself a fan of the book, and so this was absolutely a passion project for him, and you can definitely tell that Hans Zimmer had the time of his life composing the score for this movie. It's exactly what I was expecting. What I said in my trailer reaction was exactly that. This beautiful, haunting, mesmerizing mixture of Middle Eastern inspired notes, or like ancient Egyptian inspired notes with more futuristic electronic science fiction-y notes, if you will. It was exactly that. It's exactly what it needed to be, and it delivered a 10 out of 10 as far as I'm concerned. One thing I will also note, because I found it interesting from a purely, I guess, musicological aspect, if you will, because I mean, I do play a bit of music, and I have a very good ear for music and identifying instruments within like orchestral pieces. And I noticed the usage of like very loud but sharp drum notes. Very striking. And those were used at specific moments of the movie, and I've never really heard those in a movie before, so that was really interesting. You also had beautiful choral pieces, or I mean vocals. I'm not sure I'm using the right word, I might be translating in my brain from French. Sorry about that. So beautiful vocals, higher feminine notes, perhaps somewhat Northern African inspiration. I'm a huge sucker for like intense vocals and choruses. No, that's the right word, not chorals. Choruses in instrumental music. Think something like Duel of the Fates by John Williams. Some pieces, or I mean specifically Light of the Seven from Ramin Djawadi from the Game of Thrones OST, or I mean there's a shit ton of that actually in the OST for Bloodborne. I'm a huge sucker for that kind of music, so that, you know, it was right up my alley. I was very, very happy with that. I guess the only thing I could point out that was just a bit different, but not negative at all, is I didn't really identify a central musical theme, I guess. It was a bit more diffuse, just different melodies and different notes coming together to create this beautiful whole. Just different parts, but always being in harmony with one another. So again, not negative at all, but it's just nothing extremely specifically identifiable as the Dune theme at first listen, I guess. And like, well, I mean, think of major themes from the Harry Potter movies, the Lord of the Rings movies, even the Star Wars movies. I'm not saying it wasn't there, I just didn't quite pick up on it. In all fairness, that could also be because my ears were pretty violently assaulted at times by the sound level because of the Imax experience. So perhaps I missed things at times because my senses were just all over the place. The OST would definitely benefit from a re-listen, and more specifically a re-listen outside of the movie, because I like to do that. So as soon as I can get the OST, I'm gonna re-listen to it, and maybe I'll change my mind about that. So, you know, take it with a pinch of salt. And I'm going to move on to the acting. Again, a bit of a disclaimer. Kind of like with books, I'm not a character-focused or character-driven reader. And I'm not a character-driven or acting-driven movie watcher, I guess. Or I mean, actually, ironically, I might pay more attention to character in movies because I watch different kinds of things in movies than I read in books, but whatever. I don't have any complaints about the acting. To me, the acting was very good. There were very good performances, but it's just not the thing I focused on the most, I guess. Of course, there are exceptions I'm going to get to in a second. But so, I mean, I paid more attention to like the world design, the thematic delivery, the music. I was also, you know, comparing it to the book in my mind as I was watching the movie. And there are exceptions, like I said, little performances that really stood out to me. Ironically enough, some of the performances that stood out the most to me were some of the more minor ones, like Charlotte Rampling as Reverend Mother Gaius Helen Mohiam was amazing. It was a fairly short performance on screen, but it was just like perfect, absolutely on point. And then also the performance of Javier Bardem as Stilgar. Now, I mean, Stilgar's not a minor character in Dune, right? But let's just say that in this first part, he's a bit less present. And I really enjoyed him as Stilgar. I thought he was absolutely perfect, perfectly encapsulated that character. And then I was absolutely floored by the performance of Alexander Skarsgård as the Baron Harkonnen. Like, just carried that role like a boss, menacing, creepy, gross, absolutely perfect. And I'm like, the dude must have put on so many layers of like synthetic fat and makeup. That must have been pretty uncomfortable, but like his presence on screen was amazing. And then I was particularly impressed by the performance of Rebecca Ferguson as the Lady Jessica. The Lady Jessica is a very complex and complicated character. I mean, she basically fucks up majorly with regards to the Bene Gesserit and their plans. Whether that is fundamentally a good or a bad thing, I mean, you be the judge of that based on what happens next in the following books. But so yeah, she's a fascinating character, very grey, complex character, and I really felt it through Rebecca Ferguson's performance. The internal conflicts, the love, the deep love she has for the Duke Leto, the love she has for her son, but also the guilt she feels with regards to the Bene Gesserit, and feeling conflicted and then learning that she's pregnant. I mean, yeah, she really carried it. And then, of course, Timothée Chalamet as Paul Atreides was excellent. Really encapsulated also these pretty violent times, internal conflicts, learning that he's kind of a pawn in a much bigger game, a much bigger planning scheme by the Bene Gesserit, and just feeling conflicted about what he thinks will be his future role in history and within the universe of Dune. But then also at times just kind of accepting it and then stepping up to that role as a leader, a messianic figure potentially. You know what I mean if you read the books, obviously. What really sold it to me was the interaction between the Lady Jessica and Paul Atreides. And that is actually one of my favorite parts in the book, is when both of them are basically stranded in the desert of Arrakis and they eventually get to the Fremen, right? And I guess I'm not that used to seeing mother-son relationships fleshed out quite that way in literature, or I mean SFF literature more specifically, so I really found that part in the book super interesting and very engaging, and that was translated to the screen absolutely perfectly. I thought the interactions between them carried so much emotion, so much conflicted emotions more specifically. It was really, really well done. So now I'm going to touch upon the quality of the movie as an adaptation, specifically a book-to-movie adaptation. Again, without going into spoilers quite yet. This is it, people. Like, this is the Dune adaptation. Plain and simple. This potentially, right, because it's the first half of a two-part movie, but this has truly the potential to be the Lord of the Rings for science fiction, or, I mean, science fantasy, if you want, sure. But yeah, I mean, it's that level of good, of grand, of epic, of majestic, of impressive. When the movie ended, I had a similar feeling to the one I had at the end of The Fellowship of the Ring. And they're very different kinds of stories, don't get me wrong. Like, I'm not saying Lord of the Rings and Dune are that similar thematically or just in the kind of setting. Like, I personally think the Duneverse is a lot more dark and nihilistic than something like Lord of the Rings, even though there is also a lot of melancholy and sadness in Lord of the Rings. But I had that feeling. Like, this really has the potential to be the defining science fiction movie for years to come. Fingers crossed we get, at the very least, part 2. In an ideal world, we would at least get the first Dune trilogy. For my part, you can kind of stop there, though I'm sure a lot of the people in the fandom will want books 4, 5, and 6 as well. But I mean, those are much less important to me. An interesting difference I observed between the movie and the book. The book Dune is very exposition heavy, which I personally don't mind. Like, you always have these epigraphs, I think they're called, you know, like these bits of text at the beginning of every single chapter, which describes aspects of the politics of Dune, the world building, it foreshadows events in the future of the greater story. I love that stuff. Like, you also have that in The Left Hand of Darkness, you have that in the Wind Wing Flame trilogy. I really enjoyed that, actually, in my SFF fiction. The movie adaptation, though, isn't really exposition heavy at all. Now, some critics have actually pointed to this as something potentially negative, insofar as it could discourage non-book readers from really engaging with the material and understanding what the hell is happening, what the stakes are, etc. But keep in mind, I saw this with my mum and my dad. My mum is not an SFF reader. She's not an SFF fan specifically. She had no issue following the movie whatsoever. But basically, Denis Villeneuve doesn't hold your hand. He drops you in the universe of Dune. I mean, there's a bit of like narrated exposition at the very beginning of the movie, but then you just get bits and pieces. But yeah, you also have to put them together yourself, I guess. I mean, again, if you're a book reader, book fan, this is easy peasy, easy clap, like there's no effort to be made. But I think, like, if you're not a book reader, you can still piece all these little elements together to create the backdrop for the story, the backdrop for the thematic explorations. And honestly, I think it's pretty similar to how it is with Lord of the Rings. I didn't feel that you were really handheld in Lord of the Rings. You're also kind of dropped in that grand universe. Now, perhaps it's a wee bit more familiar because of all the mythological inspirations, maybe, but I mean, that's debatable, I think. So yeah, you're definitely not handheld in Dune, but you can definitely understand what's going on from visual cues as well, visual context, what is said between characters, but you do have to piece some elements together, which I think is part of the fun of the movie. I mean, if I were to go into a story I didn't know anything about beforehand, I can find that enjoyable in a piece of art, whether it's a TV series, a video game, or a movie, so I think this can work perfectly fine for non-book readers. And then I would also say, again, it's not really spoiling anything, I felt that it seemed to me, in any case, that Denis Villeneuve is focusing more really specifically on the Fremen and their struggles and their relationship with the planet of Arrakis and, you know, all that ecological, anthropological messaging. There are the politics, like they're present, don't get me wrong, but I felt it was just a wee bit less focused on the politics than the book is. At least for part 1. The politics is still there, and we're definitely gonna get that heavy theming regarding, you know, charismatic leaders. The like little hints dropped, said by Paul Atreides himself, in line with what you find in the book. But it was also less just in your face, I guess, than in the book Dune. Like, the Landsraad is mentioned, but it's less present in a way. It's more about the Fremen and their struggles with regards to the powers that be of the Landsraad, which have been oppressing the Fremen for however many years. So I think that was an interesting angle to take. But again, we have to keep in mind that this is part 1, and there's a crap ton of theming and concept development that also comes in later in the book and later in the series, obviously. So this might also come in a bit more heavily in, fingers crossed, part 2, right? So now I'm going to go into spoilers for the movie. They're obviously not book spoilers, or I mean story spoilers if you've read the book. I mean, this part is for the book readers, the book fans, who already want to know what to expect more or less when they go see the movie. This is for you, and also just so I can wax poetic about what I loved specifically about the movie with regards to the way it adapted the source material and things like that. So, like I said, it's an excellent adaptation. Clearly, Denis Villeneuve was the man for the job. He loves this source material. You can definitely feel that when you go see this movie. This movie is an ode to Frank Herbert's Dune. And it was a very accurate adaptation in the way it depicted a lot of like I said, the costume designs, the character type designs, like the Mentats, the Bene Gesserit, and the sets, or I mean, they're not really sets, but like fictitious cities, Caladan, Arakeen, Yedi Prime, Seleucia Secundus. I didn't really say this in the previous part, but actually, for example, on Seleucia Secundus, you see, I guess it's an initiation ritual for the Sardaukar. They're being like anointed with blood, and there's this deep bass chanting from a huge pillar, which I actually see in one of the trailers. And that actually already gives me the religious influence vibes, which are a core part of the theming in Dune. But it's not explicit, is what I meant. You have to pick up on it. Like, I guess if you haven't read the book, you would see that and figure, okay, it's some kind of weird religious, spiritual indoctrination going on, which, I mean, yeah, it's going to be very relevant to the theming for Dune, but it's not explicitly explained as such, if you get my meaning. The sandworms, obviously, they were majestic. Shai Hulud has found a worthy cinematic incarnation. I was very happy about that. I'm also happy to report that the blue within blue eyes were actually perfect. I had said in my trailer reaction that I was a bit concerned it wouldn't be quite blue enough in the sclera. No, it's perfectly fine. The eyes are perfect. I'll just point out the few little things I noticed weren't there from the book. I might have missed other things, but those were the ones that, came to mind. So there's a banquet scene in the book with like representatives of different families of influence on Arrakis and dignitaries. That is not in the movie. And there's also a scene where Lady Jessica is in a type of greenhouse or a hothouse within the palace of Arakeen. And she's actually a bit surprised at the presence of this luscious vegetation that requires obscene amounts of water given, the environmental conditions of Arrakis. That's not in the book. However, I think some of the character interactions and, I guess, plot development which you have in that scene is present in the movie, it's just in a different setting. Actually, overall, I would say that that whole part within Arakeen, the palace, goes by even a little bit more quickly than it does in the book. Or not, it's actually a bit hard to judge that because I was just so immersed in the movie, I didn't really see time going by, so again, take that with a massive pinch of salt. But I just felt that was played down a bit, which is also why I said the politics were toned down just a bit. The tragedy, the human tragedy aspect of Dune, that was very present and actually played up a bit as well, I would say, in contrast to the purely political aspects. I'm a nitpicky bitchworm, is how I've chosen to call myself with regards to that. You all know this from my book reviews and things like that. The only thing where I was like, okay, you chose a different route. Fair enough. You can't adapt everything exactly as it is described in a book. I can respect that. So you do actually see a few Guild Navigators. You see them in the trailer. There's this Imperial delegation sent to Caladan to pass on the fiefdom of Arrakis to House Atreides. And they're like 4 or 5 people in white robes carrying staffs. And they're in, what do you call those? Well, I mean, kind of spacesuits. There's glass in front of their face. And if you notice, the glass is orange, and that is basically spice gas. So melange gas, in which Guild Navigators are described as living in. But they look very human-like. They're humanoids. They're just, breathing spice gas all the time. Whereas in the books, as you know, Guild Navigators are described as looking a bit amphibian-like, with like weird fin-like hands and legs, and then just kind of floating around these big tubes of melange gas. That is not at all the visual depiction Denis Villeneuve went for, which I guess is fine. Like, it's a minor thing, it's fine. That being said, I'm a bit confused as to why he didn't want to represent that in a convincing fashion when there's a scene taking place on Yedi Prime when Reverend Mother Gaius Helen Mohiam goes to see the Baron Harkonnen for, the plotting that goes on with that. And you see for like a few seconds this weird looking creature that kind of looks like a genetically modified human transformed into a spider type thing, drinking from a bowl. And I was like, what the hell was that? In a weird, like, tangential fashion, I guess it kind of reminded me of the futars? Is that what they're called again? I'm not exactly sure about the name. Those cat-like humanoids you find from the time of Heretics of Dune onwards that the Honored Martres keep as pets or sexual slaves or something like that. I think they're called futars. I guess in a way reminded me of that, but they don't look like futards at all. And I was like, what is that? What was that? My mother was very confused and creeped out by that. She asked me, what was that thing? I was like, I have no idea. That's not the book. So I'm a bit confused that he just shoved in that weird thing, but then went for a super humanoid look for the Guild Navigators.
And also, I'm actually quite sad to report that there was no balisette playing by Gurney Halleck, though perhaps we'll see some of that in, again, hopefully, part 2, because I'm actually quite looking forward to seeing this fictional instrument and it being played by, well, this famed musically inclined warrior.
So, like I said, it's less exposition heavy than the book is. So perhaps some non-book readers might be confused as to the function of, like, different types of characters. For example, mentats are never called as such. They're never named as mentats. But I guess you can figure out that they're basically, like, heads of intelligence. There's Pietra? What's the mentat of the Baron. I can't remember his exact name, but I mean, he has that look with the little mark on the lower lip, and you have Thufir Hawat, who has that as well, so I guess you can figure out that they're intelligence gatherers, basically, but they're never actually named as mentats, and it's never specifically referenced that Paul Atreides was also trained as a mentat. The whole thing with the Kwisatz Haderach, that's definitely in there. The scene with the Gom Jabbar was one of my personal favorites, like, the intensity, the quiet intensity of that scene was brilliant. Another favorite part of the movie for me was definitely when Paul and Jessica, crash land in the desert and then have to survive and find the Fremen, and then you have this confrontation with the Fremen involving the Lady Jessica, and I was like, the Bene Gesserit up until that point are presented as definitely big players in some fashion, like they manipulate things, they gather intelligence, but then you've got Lady Jessica basically KOing Stilgar in like 2 minutes flat, and you can see, oh right, they're also martial artists, cool. So that was a really neat moment. There is no mention of the Butlerian Jihad, like there is no reference made to the fact that AIs are not present in that universe, that AIs were banned, that there is almost a religious and legal edict against AIs. I don't think that's a problem for now. I'm sure it would be mentioned later on. And one other little detail I really liked, I think the way Denis Villeneuve, whoever was in charge of like conceptual design, the way they represented like Holtzman drive spaceships, I think that's what they were. These ginormous, basically tubes, and out of the tubes come personal carriage or freight spaceships. I'm thinking that those tubes are the Holtzman drive-driven spaceships that carry smaller spaceships that, carry passengers or freight or whatever. So I thought that was also a very clever design choice. And finally, I don't really want to spoil that bit because that's just a clear little wink at book fans. But so, Paul is not yet referenced as Muad'Dib, but there is something which is shown that's in relationship to his moniker, to his epithet, his honorific as Muad'Dib. And the way it was like introduced and shown was just... I'm not gonna say what it is. You can probably guess what it is. You'll see when you see the movie. But I love that. I was like, you did that for the fans. You did that for us, mate. I see it. I see what you did there, and I love it. So that was just a neat little thing. Also, before I finish off this section, if you want to know precisely where the movie ends, it actually ends just past the halfway point in the book. Basically, it ends after Paul's duel with Jamis, I think is his name. It ends as the Fremen with Lady Jessica and Paul are going towards Sichtbur. So basically this is what is in the movie, and this is what's left for part 2. So it's just, like a bit past the halfway point. So final thoughts are basically going to be a reiteration of my opening thoughts. This movie was amazing. It was beautiful. It was eye candy, feast. No, it's more than eye candy. It was a feast, an absolute feast for the eyes. The visuals were incredible. The design was incredible. The music was incredible. The acting was excellent. The quality of this movie as an adaptation was great. Exactly what any fan would want, basically. Except for like the ultra hardcore fans. I know those exist for the Tolkienverse fandom and they don't like the movies, and fair enough, to each their own. But I think most of the fans will love this movie. I'm tempted to call it a masterpiece, but I kind of want to wait for part 2. I want to see the completed story, the completed adaptation of book 1 onto the screen before I pronounce the M word. I would definitely, like I said, recommend you see this if you're a Dune fan. if you're a science fiction fan, and if you're a fan of cinema, regardless of genre. I mean, if you're a fan of cinema but not of the SFF variety, obviously it probably won't be for you. But I mean, if you're a great appreciator of film in all its genres, then you should also definitely check this movie out. It met a lot of my expectations. It exceeded some other expectations. The only thing, which you all already know, is that it's just part one. And sadly, the production studios would not greenlight Denis. I think it was his desire to go the Lord of the Rings route of like filming both parts at once. Maybe, did I get that wrong? I'm not sure. But I mean, you know, the Lord of the Rings treatment, like Peter Jackson had the brilliant idea of like filming all 3 movies in one go, which was a gamble. I'm impressed that New Line actually went for that. But sadly, Warner Brothers and Legendary Pictures, I guess, didn't want to take that risk. I mean, COVID happened also, so that didn't help things at all. And now we have to wait for part 2. Wait probably 18 months at the very least. So I wouldn't expect part 2 before 2023 at the least. Which is frustrating because the great things that happen in that bit that's left of the book. And I mean, I want to see Aaliyah as well. And I want to see, you know, the spice agony that Jessica goes through and Paul's awakening with the spice, etc., etc. So we're just gonna have to wait. And well, I mean, first we're gonna hope that it makes enough money to, you know, greenlight part 2 even being made. So yeah, that concludes my fairly long, I think it's going to be, review for Dune Part 1, the movie adaptation by Denis Villeneuve of course, Frank Herbert's novel Dune. I hope you found it interesting, that it made you want to go see the movie if you didn't already, which is not even a thing at this point, but okay. I hope it furthered your enthusiasm and your anticipation for the movie if you unfortunately live in an area of the world where it's not coming out before the end of October. Sorry to my Anglo-Saxon friends there. It's weird, I don't know why it came out so much earlier in some European countries, because usually it's the other way around, so, but I'm not complaining about that, sorry. I mean, I feel bad for you lot, but I'm not complaining. In the meantime, though, I hope you will have a lovely day, evening, or whichever time of day you prefer. I'm going to film a couple of other unrelated reviews now. As such, I'll see you very soon again in another video. But until then, bye-bye.